Good afternoon and welcome to Talks at Google in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Today it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Damon Tweedy. Dr. Tweedy is a graduate of Duke Medical School, where his first day was uncomfortably exciting, but not in the good Google way. Yale Law School. He's assistant professor of psychiatry at Duke University Medical School and staff physician at the Durham VA Medical Center. He's the author of one of the most talked about books of this season and one of my favorite books of the year, Black Man in a White Coat, a doctor's reflections on race and medicine. Writing this book is part of his ongoing effort to honor the pioneering work of black physicians of the previous generation by giving to the community as they had done. Dr. Tweedy's training and practice has shown him the challenges faced by black doctors and the health burdens faced by black patients, why being black is bad for your health. Along the way, he's overcome his own biases as well as those of other physicians and patients of all colors. He's here today to share with us what he's learned and his suggestions for how we might move forward with better treatment and more compassionate care for all. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Damon Tweedy.
Thank you. Thank you for everyone for coming today. Yeah, so it's funny to hear Google. My first thought when I hear Google is that I have this sort of connection to Google. Sergey Brin is actually from Maryland, and briefly we had attended the same high school, actually, in the same magnet program. I'll tell you a little bit more about that when I tell you my story. Now, we didn't actually know each other. Maybe I should have picked my friends better. But yeah, so I'll tell you a little more about that high school because that's really an important part of my journey as to who I am today. Okay, so this is the book. Here's the cover of the book, Black Man in a White Coat, Doctor's Reflections on Race and Medicine. So I guess the first thought is that there's so many books out there, so why should you read this book? What's in it for you? Race is all over the news. You hear about race all the time. It's often talked about in law enforcement. It's talked about in crime and punishment. Those are the areas we hear talked about so much now. But race is also an important issue in medicine. It's an important issue in medicine as well. And I wanted to give you a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. It was in 1966, and this is just sort of to set the framework. So this is 1966, 2 years after the Civil Rights Act had passed, 1 year after the Voting Rights Act had passed. And his quote was, "Of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and the most inhumane." To me, that speaks to this idea that health is so important to all of us, vital to all of us. I think he also was getting to this idea that health is about more than simply the health care and the medical treatment, and so many other factors in society are also influence health. So there are really two ways that the book approaches this issue. One is about the issue of African American patients and their health. And there are all sorts of health disparities that are out there, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. And then there's also this other experience about being an African American physician and being one of few. So nationwide, about 4% of all physicians are African American, but population is African American is about 13%. And in some specialties, it varies depending on the medical specialty that you're in. It can be 1 or 2%, just depends on the field. So I mean, you're really kind of out there. You're really sort of isolated in many ways. And so the book really explores those two areas. So I set the framework talking about using the quote from King about race and society, but this is really very much more a personal story. So maybe many years ago, he mentioned that I went to Yale Law School, and maybe years ago I may have written a book that was much more policy-oriented solutions, let's attack these problems, data-driven, solution-driven. This is very much a personal story. This is very much how I came at it. I enjoyed books by doctors, and so many of the books that I read going through medical school and in my training, so few of them talked about race at all. And when they did mention race, it was only in passing, but it was such an important issue to me, and I wanted to sort of give voice to this other perspective out there. So some of the people my book has gotten really good reception. I've actually really been overwhelmed by the positive attention that I've gotten, media coverage, all those things that I never really imagined when I first got started. But it has had some criticism, and the criticism that I've gotten is specifically about that is not policy-oriented, not solution-driven. But even though I do talk about many of those issues, but even though that's not the focus of it, I still think there's a lot to learn from this book. I'm using my own story and the stories of other people that I've seen, patients, but I think there's a lot of ways that we can learn from that. And people can come up with their own answers. So I think that's really kind of where I'm coming from in the story. But we will talk about some of the more concrete stuff as well. So I think since I set the framework of this being a very personal story, I think it's helpful to know a little bit about my background. So I grew up in Maryland, and the county's called Prince George's County. It's about 10 minutes east of Washington, D.C. Now, it's a predominantly African-American county, and there's been books written about it where they talk about it as a very affluent, very wealthy community for African-Americans. Now, there is a part of the county where that's the case, but that's certainly not where I came from. So I came from the part that was much closer to the Washington, D.C. line, all black, very segregated, very working class. Really, there were very few models of African-Americans in that community who succeeded outside of sort of the sports and kind of entertainment realm that we're so often familiar seeing African-Americans succeeding in. So as far as like going to college, just going to college as a student, I mean, that was a really alien concept in the community that I grew up in. Black men were much more likely to find themselves in the criminal justice system and all those other sorts of things that we all too often hear about. So my parents did not go to college. My dad didn't even finish high school. I did have an older brother. Brother's 10 years older than me, and he did go to college. He was one of the first people in my family to attend college. He went to the University of Maryland, and he was there just strictly on academics, and that was just a novel thing. So for me to have that in my home was a huge example. But even still, the idea of being a doctor was something that was still far beyond what I could have ever envisioned. So in 8th grade, I was in middle school, and very sort of average, below average kind of middle school, 90%, 95% African American. And one day a math teacher said, well, you should try and take this test for this magnet program. You might be able to make it. And my first thought was, no, I'm thinking, no, I'm not going to be able to do that. No one I know has done that. But I took it on the flyer, and I got into this program. And this is a very great science technology magnet program. And this is actually the same one that Mr. Brin was in as well. And so that's really kind of set me on a different path in a way. And I got to see people with different aspirations and things of that sort, and different experiences. So that's sort of how I got on a trajectory to where I am today. Now, it was an appeal to me, like why being a doctor? So there was appeal in science and medicine. So I was really attracted by the idea of formulas and equations. It was all very objective, and it was sort of concrete. So much of life is messy as an African-American person. Life in general can be messy, but as an African-American, it can be even more messy. And so there was a certain appeal that science and medicine held out for me, that it was objective. It was concrete, and I could kind of escape this other world, this other reality. And so that's really what kind of led me on this path from high school through college and into medical school. But when I got to medical school, I kind of had a rude awakening, and so that's really where the book begins. It sort of lays that groundwork. So I did really well in college, and I had a lot of opportunities for medical schools, and I ended up ultimately deciding on Duke. I was deciding between Duke and Johns Hopkins, which is closer to my home. Duke was at that point trying to recruit more African-American students, and they started to offer scholarships as a way to entice African-American students because they'd had a long history of not being able to recruit African-Americans. You can imagine it's in the South. You can imagine all the reasons why. So let me just read for a few minutes the introduction to this story because I think that really sets the framework. So I'm coming in, I told you about my background, where I come from, and what I was thinking when I came to Duke. I was hoping I was going to become a cardiologist, someone who's just going to operate, fix the heart, concrete, and so that was sort of my mindset. And then I got to Duke, and something else happened. So let me just read that introduction to you. It'll take about 4 minutes, and then I'll discuss a little more after that. Okay. On a spring morning in 1997, Jim Harper, a young man from Durham, North Carolina, woke up in his 2-bedroom apartment with no clue that he would soon become gravely ill. The first signs of trouble seemed innocent enough. Numbness on the right side of his face and hand, easily chalked up to having slept on that side of his body. He stumbled as he got out of bed, but figured he was simply tired from the previous day's work. His fiancée, Regina, asked if he needed to see a doctor. He smiled and told her that she worried too much. Her anxiety ebbed as she went off to her job at Kmart, only to resurface when he didn't answer the phone during her lunch break. When Regina rushed home a few hours later at the end of her shift, she found Jim sprawled across their bathroom floor. His eyes were wide open and he recognized her, but his words were garbled. He couldn't tell her what was wrong or how long he'd been that way. She frantically dialed 911. Within a half hour of his arrival at the emergency department, after a neurological exam and CAT scan of his brain, it was clear what had happened. Jim, just a few weeks shy of 40, had suffered a massive stroke. The doctors learned that Jim had high blood pressure that had been poorly treated, but nothing else to account for his tragic fate. He had no heart problems, no aneurysms, no diabetes or high cholesterol. He didn't smoke, rarely drank, and avoided street drugs. Ultimately, as best they could tell, Jim mostly had a lot of bad luck. About 2 weeks later, I stood at the foot of Jim's bed at Duke Hospital. Along with another first-year medical student, I was shadowing Dr. Wilson, a neurologist, as part of a weekly class that introduced us to clinical medicine. This was the highlight of our week, as it gave us a brief break from the lecture hall and laboratory and provided a peek at our future lives on the hospital wards. We wore perfectly knotted ties, as I tried to today, and crisp white coats for the occasion, trying hard to look like the doctors we would one day become. But Jim's future seemed far less promising. A big man, he had once been a football player. Now he could not move the right side of his body. His face drooped as saliva dribbled out of the corner of his mouth. Given his lack of improvement, the doctors had begun to doubt he could make any recovery. They were preparing to send him to a facility. This place also had a long-term care unit where, if he made no progress, he might spend the rest of his life. "It's a very sad case," Dr. Wilson said as we left the room and walked to a conference area to discuss our patient and his illness. He started by telling us that stroke was consistently one of the top causes of death and disability in America. Then he drilled us about the major risk factors, going back and forth between us in a competition of sorts. In eager medical student fashion, we rattled off the usual suspects: diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, old age, smoking, and high cholesterol. I ran out of fingers there. When it was my turn again, Dr. Wilson indicated that there was one important risk factor we had yet to mention. He looked at me with a worried frown. "Come on," his look said. "For you of all people, this should be easy." I sighed. I'd hoped it wouldn't come to this, but as I was quickly learning, it always did. "Race," I said, looking down at my dark hand against my pristine white coat. "Our patient is black." "Exactly," Dr. Wilson said, as if I'd now earned a top score on my exam. "Some would say that this is the most important variable of all." He rattled off statistics about stroke, race, and stroke. The risk is twice as high for blacks compared to whites for those over 65, and in younger groups, such as our patient here, the ratio is more like 3 to 1, or even 4 to 1. I'd seen the impact of stroke on both sides of my family. When I was 14, my dad's brother, who would often drive 5 hours each way on a Saturday just to visit us for a few hours, died within days of collapsing at his home, putting an abrupt end to his visits that I always enjoyed. A few years later, my maternal grandmother, Grandma Flossie, developed dementia from a series of minor strokes that slowly stole her mind and eventually her body. Like Jim, both had high blood pressure. Our patient's other major risk factor is hypertension, Dr. Wilson continued. This is also much more prevalent in blacks, nearly twice as common. No matter how you slice it, race is a very big deal when it comes to stroke. Dr. Wilson had hammered home something I would learn time and again, both at Duke and beyond. Being black can be bad for your health. So that really lays the framework. So I'm coming to medical school feeling as if I'm escaping this world and going into a world that's objective and concrete. And during that first year, I was inundated by these messages that there was something wrong with being black in terms of health. So every time you learn about a disease, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, the professors would start with the biology of it, what they call the pathophysiology of the disorder, and then they would always kind of go back to the end and talk about the demographics, like who's it affect. And there were always two statements. It's more common in black people, and black people who get the disease do much worse. So those were the statements they would make. And so for me, the next question was, why? And what could be done about it? And never seemed to get answers to either of those questions during that time. It was just sort of these statements that were made out there. And not only was it these statements, not only was it like an intellectual side to it, but there was this personal side to it, because these are things that affected me in my own family, and actually myself, that I'll talk about more later. And so it had great meaning. So this is really one of the two main goals of the book, to really to explore those questions, like what does all this mean and why are we in this situation? So that's one of the two main goals of the book. And what I discovered along the way as I started to go out into the community and start to see patients and get to see, so I really saw that there were like 3 different ways of looking at this problem. And I talk about these in the book. And what I do is I use case studies of people that I actually saw in various settings to illustrate what these issues are. So certainly there's an issue at the big level, the macro level, the system level, society. Black people are much more likely to be uninsured, much more likely to live in communities that are either segregated, less access to medical care, primary care specialists. All those things are very true. And this has all been known for a long time. What I wanted to do in the book was to sort of use examples of real people to illustrate how this really plays out in real life. And so in medical school, we one day volunteered at a clinic about 90 minutes from campus. And this is a eastern part of North Carolina. The community is 50-50. half white, half black. But in this clinic you go to, everyone there is black, all black. That's where and it's a charity clinic, so it's a clinic for people who can't afford other health care. Patients don't have health insurance. And it's pretty clear when you get there that you're providing care, a level of care that is in many ways substandard. The patient, despite your best efforts or intentions, the patients can't afford medications, lab tests, all the usual things that we take for granted. Even the site of it is so different. You think about the typical medical clinic. So this kind of clinic, there's no nurse there. The students are taking the blood pressure and doing everything that a nurse would ordinarily do. It's like it was a one-room house. I mean, you're not talking about anything that any of us most likely are experiencing. And so that really illustrated all, sort of the big issue problems in a sort of micro way. There's another time, a couple years later, where I worked in an inner city emergency room. So it's sort of the opposite end. That one was a very rural clinic. This is an inner city emergency room clinic down in Atlanta. And there you saw many of the same problems again, even though Atlanta, even though the residents, people are living in what seems like a metropolitan area, there are ways that they're cut off from society. And it really came home to me one day when we took an ambulance ride. I was riding with the paramedics and went out to this, got a call to go out to this community. And it's like you go off on this road and you're there for like 5 or 10 minutes. It feels like you're going into the woods and the wilderness in ways. It's like a suburb. But then you come into this really, really just gruesome, horrible housing project. And you just see the chaos and you see how all that affects health. And so you see obesity, violence, addiction, everything's just there for you. So it was a vivid illustration, and I described that scene in the book. I actually described it much better than I just explained to you in the book. But those are sort of the system level things that you see and how those influence health. But then the next layer to that is the doctor and the patient and how they get together, how they get along or don't, and how issues like trust and communication, bias, all these things impact healthcare. And so in this part of the book, I use other examples. So there's one example of a gentleman that I mentioned where he comes to a hospital with chest pain and seems to have medical problems, but winds up leaving the hospital with a psychiatric diagnosis, which was really unusual. But I mean, and the book really explores how that happened, in a real way, and so how what would seem like a concrete issue became something completely different. And I also talk about a situation where I was a patient and had a similar type of experience, where I went in one day to a clinic dressed very casually, and I was perceived one way in a sort of less than favorable way. And then once it was made aware that I was a doctor, then everything changed. And it was sort of like being two different people at one time. So those are just examples of the book of how these things can play out and affect healthcare in real ways. Then there's this other piece. So we talk about the system, we talk about the doctor and the patient, but then there's the person themselves and how they affect, and what they do, what they eat, all the daily things of life and how that affects your health. And so here in the book, I use a couple examples. There's one time where I saw two different patients, very similar backgrounds, but one was able to make the kind of health choices that led to a good outcome, and the one was the opposite. And I explore the reasons why and the ways in which choices are influenced by all sorts of things, family, surroundings, all those sorts of things. So I explore that. I also talk about it from my own personal level. As early in medical school, I was diagnosed with high blood pressure myself. And I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end, but I really explore how things that the individual does also obviously greatly influences health, and how there are cultural issues at work that sometimes, for many reasons, can affect the health of African Americans as well. So I explore all these issues. I sort of tackle everything in this book in that way. So that's one big piece of the book. Why is being black bad for your health? The second big piece of the book is, what is it like to be an African American doctor, and what is that experience like? And so that's really the second piece of the book that I talk about. As I mentioned at the beginning, African Americans are about 13% of the population, 4% of doctors. It was very common so when I went to medical school, I was in the first class at Duke where they really were increasing the numbers of African Americans considerably. In previous years, there had been much, much fewer numbers. And that raised a couple of different issues. One was this issue about how you're perceived, this perception. So you're an African American, you're sort of seen as a rare thing, and sometimes people don't know how to perceive you. And so there are a couple examples I talk about in the book. One occurred when I was a first-year medical student, when I came into a classroom and a professor approached me in a sort of angry way and asked me to fix the lights in the classroom, and was under the mistaken assumption that I was someone other than who I was. And so I talk about that incident and kind of how it affected me, because I was already kind of insecure about coming into medical school. So I explore how I dealt with that situation. There's another time a few years later as a first-year resident. So this is when you finish medical school, and your first year is called an intern. That's when you're like an MD, but you don't. So you're technically an MD, but you don't really feel like one because there's so much responsibility and you're just learning everything. And so it's a big adjustment for every doctor. But about a month into that first year, a patient, an older white gentleman, came in and One of the first words out of his mouth was that he did not want a black doctor. And he used a racial slur to sort of express what he meant. And it happened that I was the only black doctor working in the hospital at that time, which is not uncommon. So it was sort of these twist of fate or karma, whatever, that he would be assigned to the same team that I was at. So that story actually has a surprise ending that I won't spoil for you here. But then just giving an example of some of the different ways of how perception is so important to my journey. One of the issues that also comes up with being a black doctor, where you're one of few black doctors, and there's a large black population around you, is that there's this sort of supply and demand kind of issue. So there are often many African American patients, not always, but there are many who would like to have an African American provider, particularly in a field like primary care or psychiatry, which is my field, where the relationship with the doctor and the patient is especially important. And so often there's this issue that comes up where there are large numbers of African American patients and very few providers. So for instance, in Durham, so Duke's in Durham, North Carolina, the population is about 45% African American. But you look at other medical schools and hospitals. So Johns Hopkins is in Baltimore, which is 60% black, and in Atlanta, so in Philadelphia, UPenn is 50% black. Even in Boston, where it's like 25% black, something like that, that's still about double the black population nationwide, which is like 12, 13%. So even in a city like Boston or New York, where the numbers are slightly lower. So you have this dynamic of places where so many of the lead doctors or medical students and residents are trained, being in these communities with large African American populations, and where there's often historically been this sort of tension between the communities and these very sort of wealthy institutions. So the book kind of explores all those dynamics as well and what that means for you. Finally, there's this other piece. Being a black doctor, I come from, as I mentioned at the beginning, I come from a very working class African American community, segregated community. Many of the patients that I saw reminded me of myself, my family, but then I'm becoming part of this other system, this white coat, in the hierarchy of being a doctor. So black man in white coat is kind of like a symbolism, it's like having two identities, and you're navigating those two identities. And so at times I would feel as if, many times I talk about in the book, I feel like I had a foot in one world, this is the African American world, now I'm in the medical world, and so where do I fit in there? And do I have a foot in this world, and do I have a foot in that world, or do I have, so it's like trying to find your grounding. The people have written, many African American philosophers have written about this, term called double consciousness. There's all sorts of ways of looking at it, but I explore it from the context of being a doctor in the medical system. So that's another big piece of the book as well. So finally, the book talks about where does all this leave us? So I've outlined all these problems, these issues we have, and so in the book, towards the end of the book, I try and touch on that. So where do we go from here? And so when you go back to what the problems are at the level of the system, there are all sorts of problems, of course. I talk about the Affordable Care Act and kind of what the pros and cons of that, where that's left us. And so I actually, a few years ago, I went back to some of the clinics that I initially worked at as medical students and sort of tried to take stock of where things had gone, and had the Affordable Care Act helped. And it's a mixed picture because it's so politicized, it's been so politicized. Many states haven't enacted certain provisions of the Affordable Care Act. North Carolina is one of them. And that's impacted the real world effect of it. So but as a doctor, I understand we have politics and people is bitter and contentious, but as a doctor, it's hard to sometimes understand that because you're seeing patients from all political backgrounds all the time who all have the same kinds of health problems, get sick in the same way. And so you just wonder, as a doctor, why it's so difficult for us to have this, why has healthcare become such a partisan issue? That's the doctor hat. I mean, the other side of me knows why, but it's such a frustrating thing to see as a doctor, and I explore that as well. Another piece of it is about, at the macro level, is how do we get more African American doctors? And what can we do about that? And one of the more troubling things is that African American, the numbers of doctors have increased across the board pretty much over the last 30 years. Population of society has grown, and the number of doctors have grown with it. And that's true that's true in all groups of people, with the exception of African American men. So African American women, medical students and doctors, have probably doubled since the late 1970s. But African American men, the numbers have actually flatlined, in some cases even slightly declined since the late 1970s. And that's completely different than every other group in the demographic group in America. So I mean, and so that plays out for me in many ways, where I feel like I'm the only person, and people are wanting. So you feel this sort of what is my responsibility? Where do I fit in as an African American male? What can I do about that? So I explore all those kind of issues in the book as well, and not just me, but what can we do as a society as well? There's also this piece in the book where I talk about. I think it's a really important piece, because we have few black doctors. Most black patients are not going to see an African American doctor, and so there's this whole idea about how do we sort of get along with people who are very different than us. And so in the book I talk about this. I talk about a lot about the white patients I see, because about half people I see are white, and how do we make connections with people that we seem at first to be very different from? And so that's a really important piece of the book. And I give a couple examples of patients where things were just so completely different at first, you would never imagine that we could have worked together. I mean, they had perceptions, biases against me, I had biases against them. You know, we all carry these things. And so, but I give examples of how we were able to work through those things. And I like for that to be a lesson or inspiration to other doctors, you know, white doctors, Asian doctors, for how you can connect with African-American patients for whom you may have completely different backgrounds. And so I'm using stories of my encounters with people to sort of try and illuminate larger problems in our society. So that's really where I'm coming from in the book. And really, I think that's it. I think the really important piece I want to get about this, because what I've learned along the way in writing this book and getting feedback is that how little people know about these issues. I really want to educate people and just make the awareness is so key. I mean, we always hear about, again, race through this lens of criminal justice and crime and those sorts of issues, but it's a really huge deal in the healthcare sector. Really, that's, in the long run, that affects even more of us. It affects all of us. And so I really wanted to really get people aware of this issue and hopefully inspire them to, inspire health systems, because I've been talking to medical schools and healthcare systems, inspiring doctors and patients, all of us, to do better and do our part to really address this problem. So that's really my perspective on this issue, and that's really my story. So thank you for your time. Yeah. Happy to take questions. Actually, I often like the question part better, kind of engage with the audience, see what people have to say. So thank you for bearing with me.
Hi. I would love to hear sometime, more of what you have to say about the whole issue you started to discuss about young black men, okay, which seems like a really problematic group in our society right now. But so I love it if you talk about
Sure,
that and what
absolutely.
to do about it. But actually, I wanted to use my one question on another question, which is more about the Affordable Care Act.
So I will talk about the other part too, though. Go ahead.
Good. The Affordable Care Act, obviously we have some huge problems with it, like the fact that so many states did not expand Medicaid, huge problem. But two things that it's definitely done: one is it's insured a heck of a lot more people, and number two is it has made preventive care free, although it did not make the drugs free, and that's a really huge issue, I'm sure, for issues like hypertension, for example. But here's my question about it. With all these newly insured people, you would think that the demand for primary care is now growing. It's got to be bigger than it ever was before, the demand for it. Nonetheless, I've read recently that too many of the poorer insured patients are still going to emergency rooms. They're not making enough use of primary care at all, and so forth. I'm wondering how much of this problem is that the supply of primary care has not improved, and the incentives for doctors to go into primary care versus specialties has not improved. Do we actually have any signs that we're making progress in expanding primary care and preventive care in those communities? And how much of this is a problem that maybe there is more of that, but people have habits, formed from long years, and they maybe don't know about it, or they still, they're just used to going to emergency rooms? How much of it is sort of educational problems and, getting that population to think more about getting primary care that may be available to them? What are the real problems here, and what do we do about it?
Yeah, I think you touched on it was a great question. So I think you touched on many of the problems. So one is that there obviously there's a undersupply of primary care physicians compared to specialists. Their incentives are they make a lot more money. You make 2 or 3 times as much money being a specialist versus a primary care doctor. Even within that, primary care doctors are often distributed in certain geographic locations. So they may be the large number of primary care doctors in a certain area of Boston, or a certain area of, certain cities, Washington, D.C. or wherever. But then you go out to sort of the more rural areas, you find fewer. And even within larger cities, the primary care doctors are still often in certain parts of the city. So there's still that issue that you're dealing with on the access level. So as to how people are trying to address that, for instance, I'll give you an example. So at Duke's historically, it's one of those, they call them tertiary academic medical centers, sort of like the ones you hear at Harvard, where the goal is often to train specialists and researchers. But Duke has established a primary care track for medical students. This has happened in the last 3 or 4 years, where they are basically paying for the medical school tuition, which is considerable, for students who agree to go into primary care and practice primary care after medical school. And not only do that, but there's also even their education is somewhat different. It's really geared more towards this idea of continuity of care and not just this sort of like, normally in medical school you're taught in a hospital setting where it's urgent and it's acute, and so they're really trying to build relationships with people and follow them over time, which is really the purpose of primary care. So there are many schools are doing that actually. I think Harvard has a primary care track as well that they've set up. So many schools are trying to do that. I mean, we're still in the early stages so to see what the long-term effects that's going to be is still kind of unclear. So that's one aspect to it. So I think they are trying to address it. It's clearly a problem because of reasons that we just talked about. The other issue, let me just lose my train. You asked so many questions. I'm trying to make sure that I address all of them. Gosh, what was the other one? Oh yeah, about the communities and so the patterns of care. You're right. So African Americans are so much more likely to be seen in urgent care clinics, emergency room settings for what could be managed in a primary care setting. There is this pattern of that. There's no doubt about that. Here's one rub to that. One is that depending on the kind of job you have, trying to go to see a doctor requires sick leave. Some jobs don't have that. And some people, I've had patients where they get sick, they miss a few days of work, and then they can lose their job. I mean, it's so harsh in that way. Urgent care clinics, emergency room clinics are always open, late after hours, after work. So that's one way that's kind of been built up that way. That's one barrier, for instance. So I think some primary care clinics have tried to set up more flexible hours to sort of accommodate people. But then it's also a pattern, like you say, you get used to doing things a certain way. It's hard to sort of break that, and it's really unfortunate because I think one of the things is when you're seeing a doctor and you don't know that doctor and they don't know you, it's much more likely to get this impersonal care. They're less invested in you, and you're more likely to have things like bias and other things sort of intrude in the doctor-patient relationship. So it's a big problem. So I think you really outlined all the problems in many ways. Hope I addressed. So I think we're trying to address these problems, but they're huge problems to deal with. The piece about the African American men in society and doctors, I think that was the other question you were mentioning. Yeah, I mean, it's troubling on a lot of levels. I mean, so for me, one of the things that when I was first thinking I could become a doctor, still weren't very few role models, but I did a research lab I got a research position in the summer at National Institute of Health, which is in Maryland, and I met an African American cardiologist. And so the idea of seeing someone who looked like me and had gone their route, it was tremendous. I mean, so it was tremendously important to me. And I think that all too often as an African American man, I can speak to this growing up, the perceptions of what you can do and what you can accomplish are so narrow and limited in this place. And I feel like it comes from the top of society and it kind of filters all the way down to the community where you live. And I think that really just narrows what you can do. I think there was a kid in my neighborhood who I thought he was smarter than me, but he sort of kind of fell into that thing about you can only do there's only a certain narrow road to success. And I feel like that really limited how what he ultimately achieved. And so I think that's a huge problem. And so I think we can't have enough visible African Americans who are male who are succeeding in other ways. I think you just can't. And so I feel this real responsibility to try and be someone who like that. Even though it goes against my personality. My personality is really naturally very introverted and keep to myself, but it really feels like it's such an important issue. And influence is so great to be able to do that. So that's my answer to that question. I'll try and shorten my answers so people can ask questions. But it's such an issue of passion for me, those issues.
There's another barrier which I don't think I have heard mentioned, but it's something that I've observed through personal experience.
Uh-huh.
So I have a son who he's a freshman in college. He's been at college about 2 weeks. I also have the privilege of my godson who is African American,
Okay.
and wonderful, bright, nice young man. And he started school last year. He's at Mass College, MCPHS in Boston,
Okay.
for pharmacy and health services, I
Okay.
think. And he's in a physician's assistant program. It's
Okay.
a 6-year program.
Sure.
So his single mom, low income,
Uh-huh.
but they've just worked so hard.
Need to work.
Now, his first semester, he didn't, he went full scholarship, full ride.
Mm-hmm.
Great, wonderful, wonderful privilege. His first semester, he didn't do well. And second semester, he worked really hard, brought his grades up, used tutoring and all of that, couldn't bring his average up enough to keep the scholarship. So
Okay.
now he's going back, loans and all of that.
Okay.
Now, my son's going in, and and just from me being in college myself and other parents and all that, I know that freshmen often tank the first semester. It's a big shift.
It's a big adjustment.
It's a huge adjustment, But people with resources, they think, well, okay, you got C's, suck it, get up there, please. When I went to MIT, they had actually recognized this, and they have this thing for all the freshmen are pass-fail the first year because they know about that. And I look at my gods, and it feels like it's not fair. I'm like people with low resources who are depending on those scholarships, they have no margin. They have no margin. He comes in and it's like, whoa, this is harder than I thought. And also, I've read, I don't know if this is, you tell me if you agree with this or not, I've read somewhere, because I'm very interested in this whole topic, that they looked at, people who are white, people who are Asian, people who are African American, and people who are African American, I've read, are less willing to go out and ask for help, ask for tutoring resources than average. Asian Americans tend to be more willing, and it's a cultural thing, and so he didn't ask. This semester he asked, because his mom like, you're talking to the tutors, okay?
Sure.
And so that also, I'm sure, affected his grade. And, and this is a good kid, but he's now kind of
Struggling more.
Right. Is now at a more challenging place than he might have been otherwise.
Yeah, sure. I would say the margin of error is thinner. I would definitely agree with you on that part. And that is true. I think there's also, because when I started medical school, there's always this sort of there's this whole perception, right, for affirmative action, you got in because, and that you're taking spots from other people. And so there's you come with, it affects you. You hear people tell you this, and you go in and you wonder if you're going to measure up. And so the first sign that you don't measure up, it really, I could totally, you don't want to ask for help because it's sort of fulfilling this perception people already have of you that you can't make it. And so you're even less likely to seek help because you don't want to admit that you might have a problem. And so it's a huge problem. And so I think, several schools have tried to be more aggressive with being aware of that and trying to be more aggressive with trying to establish support for students in those backgrounds from the very beginning. So for instance, in college, I attended a state college at the University of Maryland, and we had a summer program, which really helped with that sort of acclimation process and got you familiar with the counselors and the people who could help you if you needed help. So I think that's a huge problem, and all too often, African American students in particular are the ones who sort of bear the brunt of that. Your story is one I've heard many times and can definitely relate to. Yes. So we're trying to do better with that, and I'm part of a program at Duke where we try and reach the people who are younger and trying to help them get through this process, particularly African American men, because there's such a huge problem that is seen all over. So absolutely, it's a great question. Any other questions? Any other thoughts? You want to have any ideas? Yeah, I'm an open book here.
It's okay if you don't have an answer for this question, but I was wondering if there's any ways you think that we can help as, pretty much white people, not in medicine. What can we do to help? Because I think a lot of us care about these kinds of inequalities, and we'd like to help solve them.
Yeah, that's a great question. People ask that question. So what can you? But the thing is, people are often underestimate. There's so much happening in the world. Problems are so big. You often feel like you're just helpless. There's nothing you can do to reverse all these problems. But you never underestimate what you can do as an individual to really improve someone's life. I still think go back to that teacher who said, well, she took time out of her day to say, well, you really should try and take this test. And she had to encourage me. I didn't want to do it. I was really thinking, no, there's no way I'm going to be able to do this. And so for her to sort of push me along that way and to get me on this path, she really helped me get me on the path. This is a 45-year-old white woman, and so she just really, her encouragement, really changed my life in many ways. Something like that. So I think there's all too often, it's easy to get discouraged and be cynical, but I think you really underestimate the power you can have. So she helped me, and now I'm in a position where I can help so many other people. And I think it sort of builds like that. And so I think that's what I would tell people, who are in a position to help people, because I'm sure all you folks here are in a position to help people in your own way. So even if you can't fix the whole problem, because so much of health is about these issues that aren't just strictly about health care and the medical treatment. You don't have to be a doctor to really improve health. If you can improve people's educational opportunities, job opportunities, you're totally transforming people's lives in ways that you may not realize. And that you're not only transforming their lives, you're transforming their health potentially. So just think about that. Just think about that as you sort of go out into the world. That's what I would say to your question. Never underestimate what you can do in that way. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Have you looked at some of the stats in the nursing field and seen how those kind of differ or match up to some of the percentages that you mentioned with
Great
physicians?
Question. That's a good question. So I'm in mental health, and so I've looked actually at, so you know, it's mental health field, there's psychiatrists and there's psychologists and family therapists and all those sort of things. So the numbers are really even lower. So actually, they're even lower than they are in medicine. It's also the case if you're looking at stats for like, I'm trying to think about nursing. I've looked at nurse practitioners. Nurse practitioners are sort of like a similar, this is a specialist kind of advanced practice nurse. The numbers there are actually lower than they are for physicians. So the numbers are like, you know, less than 5%. So I think that's pretty much across. So as far as general nursing though, like as far as RNs, I would say if it's higher, it's not much higher. I mean, I don't know the specific number to you, but it's certainly not much higher. The numbers are pretty low across the board. I mean, there's just no way around that. Yeah. I'll have to go look that up though. See, I was always told that when you come to Google that people are going to ask you questions, you're not going to be the answer, and you have to do your homework. So thank you. Any other questions? Yeah, you have another one?
So you said that you're a psychiatrist.
That's correct.
And there seems to be, and I also on my side of the family have, you know, some family history of mental illness, and so there's a shortage of psychiatrists, and there just seems to be not that many people going into psychiatry, black, white, or you know, green. So what? And you may have covered this, but I'm sorry I came in late. How did you choose psychiatry over the other specialties?
That's a really good question, because within medicine, psychiatry in many ways is kind of marginalized. I mean, every walk of life has their own hierarchy, right? And so there's a hierarchy within medicine as well, and psychiatrists are often in some ways marginalized. So when I first went to medical school, I never thought that I would be a psychiatrist. I thought I was going to be a cardiologist, a heart specialist. That's what I was really, I'd done research in that field. I had a lot of family history of heart disease, and so that was where I was really going to. And I actually started even after medical school, I actually matched into a program that was going to put me on that path. I started in the general medicine path, which is where you go before you go into cardiology. So I was all on that trajectory all the way through. And then about halfway through that year, you're getting patients that admitted to your team from all parts of the hospital, and a lot of them had mental health issues, and so, but they were still sick enough where they needed to be on the medical service. And something about working with some of those folks and realizing there's this great need to help people, it really just appealed to me in a way that I never thought it would, because I didn't like psychiatry much in medical school. I did a rotation at a hospital, didn't care for it that much. But something about that particular setting where I was at, and people started to tell me that I had an aptitude. Like I'd be able to get information from patients that other doctors weren't able to get. Like they were connecting with me in a way that they weren't with other doctors, which was all surprising to me, because I never considered myself this great social person or anything, but people were sort of connecting to me in that way, and that's really kind of got me thinking that maybe I could do this. And so that's really how I got into psychiatry. It's a huge problem as far as access to care for psychiatrists across the board. It's a huge problem. If you tie it back to race, there's a huge stigma within the African American community in terms of mental health treatment. There's a huge stigma. So the numbers of black people seeking mental health care is it's a big issue that I'm dealing with. So there's so many layers to that. I mean, part of it is how psychiatrists are. Again, the perception of it. There's sort of this stigma. For many times, it was funded separately. So the mental health paying, there'd be medical care, and people separated out, and that's further sort of stigmatizing the mental health treatment. So there's so many factors at work. There's supposed to be, I know that they passed the Mental Health Parity Act and the Affordable Care Act is supposed to help with some of these issues. All that remains to be seen. You know, I think it's still a big issue, and hopefully it'll be getting better. But I mean, it's a huge problem. We see it every day.
I just wonder if you have any thoughts about the separation between medicine and dentistry, and whether you're aware of how any of these issues that you talked about are different or the same in dentistry, or whether that wall affects things.
Yeah, so the issues are pretty similar, actually, as far as the issues. If you're talking about the issues around race and poverty and access to care, in some ways they're worse. I mean, dentistry is kind of like, in some ways, dentistry is often like finding an affordable dentist. It's almost like finding an affordable psychiatrist. Those are really difficult things to do. So in some ways, it's even worse than in general medicine, actually, when you're talking about from the perspective of poverty and race, in terms of like numbers of minority providers and all that, it's even worse. As far as why they're separated, yeah, I'm not so sure about the historical basis for separating them out. That I'm not so sure about. But the issues are still very pertinent, very relevant, no doubt about that. It's so amazing, actually. You'll see patients in the medical setting, and they have all these. You're managing health problems, but you can clearly see they have dental needs that need to be addressed. And trying to find something that they can receive is just unbelievable. The waits for them to get care for dental problems. I mean, we're talking several months. I mean, months and months and months. I mean, if someone had to come in like we're just a raging infection to get any kind of treatment, it'd be really sick to get treatment, which is sort of perverse, right? Because the whole point is to sort of prevent these problems from happening. So yeah, in dentistry sometimes it's even worse. That's been my experience anyway. Yeah, absolutely. Great. One more question about, yeah.
So obviously this is a very universal problem
Absolutely.
across the U.S. Are there any communities in the U.S. or globally that are doing this or handling this issue well, where there's progress being made that you guys have identified?
I think there are actually quite a few that there are a lot of sort of small pockets of things. I mean, there are several sort of, what do you call them, nonprofit institutions that are sort of dedicated to addressing some of these problems. There's like the Kaiser Family Foundation, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. A lot of times they will give grants to various community level programs, which are helpful, but again, we're talking about limited, it's sort of like a small piece of the puzzle. And so the issue is, can we replicate these? Can we get the support we need to make these happen? But this happening even within Durham, there are programs that we've set up that have been helpful, but it's just like, how do we sustain it? And how do we just, once the program's over, if you leave, then you kind of back where you are. How do we sustain these initiatives? Yes, I think there are a lot of examples actually. I didn't give you one specific one, but there are many throughout the country. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's a huge problem. Yeah, so I thank everybody for coming. I'm going to hang around if anyone has any other questions, and if there's books. I will say that, I only gave a sort of a sampling of the book, and I think the book's, I'm a better writer than I am a speaker, so with that said. But I really appreciate you guys asking some really good questions. And yeah, it's a big problem. And I think, as you say, I think there's something for everybody to learn about and to think about their own role and how they can help. And so I think, yeah, don't lose sight of that. I would really encourage you all to feel that way as you leave here today. So thank you.